From Farm to Table. This mouth-watering image was awarded an excellence at the 2023 PPOC National Image Competition and also became part of their loan collection. PPOC, for those who don't know, stands for Professional Photographers of Canada. After the completion of the competition, 40 of the top scoring images are selected based on overall impact, technical merit, composition, and presentation. These then become the PPOC Loan Collection, which represents the best of Canadian photography. Jules, the maker of this image, explains how, overcoming all his personal challenges, he created this award-winning image. Welcome to Award-Winning Images Explained. My name is Manpreet and I am your host. Today, we have the distinct pleasure of interviewing the incredibly talented and award-winning photographer Jules Sherred. With a unique perspective on food photography, Jules brings to life the philosophy that food should evoke memories, emotions, and hunger in people. Based in Duncan, BC, Jules is not only a renowned photographer but also a writer, journalist, and a passionate advocate for disability and trans rights. I am thrilled to chat with you today, Jules. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Jules, you're a person with a number of talents and a passion that drives you. I would love to know briefly about your background and how you got started with photography.
See, that's a big question. But so my dad was a photographer, not a professional photographer, but he was an amateur. And growing up, his photos were all over the place, and he used to do like infrared photography and stuff like that. And I was just always fascinated with photography. So I need to explain to people, my camera's up there, but I have vision problems, and with my glasses are trifocals and they're test lenses, and so I have to be looking at a certain angle to be able to see things. So I'm not trying to avoid the camera, just to explain that to people. So it's just me trying to be able to see. So my dad was a photographer, amateur, and he used to do really amazing things with film and infrared photography, and I used to like trees and stuff, but they were all red. They were just amazing images, and so I was always enamored with photography. And anytime we could afford a disposable camera or whatever, I was right there buying it. And then in high school, I was in like the extracurricular photography club, I guess is what it's called. And so I've always been in photography, and I was like doing photographer amateurishly up until my mid-20s, and then I took a pause because life happened, and then I got back into it during the pandemic. And people are always like, wait, you've only been doing this for like full time again for like 3 years and you're already at where you're at? I'm like, but that was because I had all those years of experience beforehand. Like, I'm not coming at it brand new. It was basically just jumping on the bicycle and starting from where I was, except for I used to work with film and then going to digital. So that was like my biggest trick, was learning how to work with digital, because it is different than film, and I was so used to, and that's why 95% of my work is done in camera, because I'm still, my mindset is still, this is film, and I have very limited with what I can do afterwards, so you better get it right, otherwise you're wasting a frame. So that's how I come at it.
So in between, you totally stayed away from photography, is it?
Well, except for like on my phone, right? It's like that, but like doing it for any prolonged amount of time, I was, except for just like shooting stuff on my phone, I was completely out of photography for a good 20 years, I want to say. It was a long
Wow.
time. Life happened. I was dealing with life. And so disability and raising kids and just a whole bunch of other stuff that I had no time
Yeah.
photography. And then, yeah, I got back into it and, well, hold on. Yeah, it was 2020 when I got back into photography.
This image, from farm to table, it has so much mood in the way it's lit and ticks all the boxes for judges to look at. Your main subject draws the viewer's attention with color, contrast, focus, leading lines, as well as the fact that it's been placed in the classic rule of thirds. Was this done as a personal project or was it done for a client? And what inspired this image?
So, kind of personal project slash client because it's for a cookbook, but it's for my cookbook. Um, so it was one of the images that in my cookbook that just came out in May are recipes as Duke Borscht, and it's a family recipe, and a lot of the recipes in the cookbook are important cultural recipes for different people for lots of different reasons. And one that I pulled from my own culture was Duke Borscht. And when you sell a cookbook to a publisher, you have to do a proposal. And part of the proposal, like it's better if you have a photographer attached to it, and you have to include images in the proposal to give the publisher an idea of how you see your own book, right? A lot of times the publisher will override the art direction and there will be someone else doing it, but it's always helpful for the publisher if you can present to them a vision of what you think your book should look and feel like. And so that image was one of the images that I shot for that. And it ended up, a different version of it ended up being in the cookbook itself. And the process slightly different because in um, when I'm shooting for things that will be printed on canvas or on a website or whatever, I always drop my blacks. But when you are printing or doing the post processing for something that's going to be in a cookbook, you want to lift your blacks because the printing adds more black to it by nature, and so they're slightly processed differently
Right.
afterwards, but the look is the same, which is really
Yeah.
it all depends on how it's going to be printed afterwards, what you do
Right.
with it in the post. So that's how it came about was um, because of a recipe that's in my cookbook and needing to sell my not only my abilities as a writer and a recipe developer, but also as a photographer because I wanted to photograph my own book. So,
Right. And that I believe is would have been CYMK printing rather than RGB.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Now,
So it's
before we get into the image, you want to give a quick, brief, like couple of sentences, um, explanation about what this cookbook was about?
I have it right here. So it's called Crip Up the Kitchen: Tools, Tips, and Recipes for the Disabled Cook. And it just came out in May, and it's basically that: tools, tips, and recipes for the disabled cook. And this is actually another one of the recipes, or it's the other part of the Duke Borscht but that's the version that it was in the cookbook. So it looks the same, but on the computer they look completely different. But the
Yes.
end result looks like it's the same processing, but on screen they're completely different. Um, so yeah, it's just 50 recipes. I mean, the first part has tools that you need in your kitchen if you're disabled, and then it has a whole bunch of tips and tricks to get your kitchen in order, how to organize, how to cook with, oh, like how to meal plan with only having to cook 8 times a month, which sounds like what? But that's what it is. And then it's 50 recipes, and there's everything from like samosa and matzah and butter chicken and Mexican ground beef casserole is like cuisine from around the world, and they're all very culturally significant to different cultures. And then they go into the food history, a lot of them, and how the effects of colonization, why we enjoy these foods, in Canada, and how and the history behind some of the upheaval that caused all these people to choose Canada as their home. So, like for the butter chicken recipe, because people think it's an old recipe, but it talks about how the partition of India and Punjab specifically resulted in butter chicken being created, and how it's a story um, of not only like upheaval and colonization, but also of resilience of somebody being thrown in, like having to move from the homeland and settle into a new place and do a new and cooking their home flavors without necessarily having access to the same stuff that they would have had they still been living in their hometown in Punjab. So it has the same for a lot of the Jewish recipes. The Dukabor recipe also has a long history of the Dukabor people and why their foods are now in Canada. So it's a little bit of everything.
Interesting, because I'm from Punjab and I did not know that
Hmm.
it was related to the partition.
Yeah.
But I'll talk to you sometime about that. Anyway, I'd like to also talk a little bit more about the book afterwards, but let's
Hmm.
get to the image. Now, in this image, I can see that there's not a whole lot in terms of post processing that went on. However, um, with my experience, my own experience with food photography, I know there's a lot that goes into the prep of getting the image.
Yeah.
Do you do your own styling or do you work with a stylist?
I do my own styling. It's one of the services that I offer through my food photography, and it's a completely for a lot of people don't know that styling is its own service with its own rates, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not part of being a photographer.
That's
Um,
right.
and a lot of people don't understand that styling is its own skill. You have to cook food specifically for camera, and there's a different way to cook food for camera, and you have to know what those tricks are. And with food, whatever you're selling there can be no hanky panky done to that, right? It has
Right,
to
right.
be um, like you
Edible.
can. It has to be edible. It has to be what is being sold. It has to be what is
Yeah,
being photographed. So
yeah,
you really need to know how
yeah.
to do that.
You can't use mashed potatoes for ice cream.
Exactly. Oh, you
Right.
could if the ice cream is not being sold and is in the
No,
background
right.
as not being the subject, but if it is the thing being sold, it has to be the thing being sold that you're
That's right.
photographing.
That's right.
So it's a tough job. On bigger
Yeah,
jobs, then sometimes I get the privilege of working with a stylist, so I'm not doing both because like the
yeah.
butter, like this borscht image was like 10 hours from like prep, 3 hours to cook, an hour to style, photographing, then post production and shopping and all that other stuff. So like most food images have 8 hours of labor behind them. It's a lot of work.
Wow,
Hmm.
wow.
Yeah.
Well, I would relate it to as the makeup artist is separate from a photographer, so a
Yeah.
stylist is separate from.
Yeah.
But definitely, makeup artist doesn't take 8 hours.
Hmm.
Now, I would love to know how this image came together. So, next couple of questions are going to be about that. What were you trying to convey with this shot?
So my memories of Doukhobor Borscht growing up is having my baba, which is Russian for grandma, sitting at her kitchen table, which is used for prep, and really rustic kitchen table that you would expect in Eastern European homes because Eastern European kitchens are a little bit different than Western kitchens. And like doing it my Bubba's way was like 5 to 6 hours just to make this dish. Like it's very labor intensive, and but it was warm, like just the sunlight, and it was just a warm, loving experience. And
Mm-hmm.
so I wanted to capture, like I photograph based on feelings and images like I like to feeling, and I keep changing things until I have that somatic response of like, oh, okay, this is my grandma's hug, right? So it was having to capture that whole warmth and love of my grandma and just that warm feeling in her kitchen, in the Kootenays. So
Wow, I love the way you say that. It's so beautiful. Um, Talk a little bit about the props that were used. Is there a reasoning behind their use, and
Um,
or did you just use what was on hand?
so it was some of the props I purchased specifically for this image because I knew I wanted to do it in the proposal, right? So in the background here, let me bring this. I think this is a good
Yeah,
time
sure.
to share my
Screen.
screen. Okay, so this wooden storage crate I bought specifically for this image, and you can't really see it, but right back here, there's a little hint of it. There is a burlap, big, huge burlap table runner back here that I used to
Okay.
add a little bit of warmth in the background. And these burlap placemats I bought specifically for it, and then everything else or other props that I had in hand, and they all work together color wise, right? So the wooden crate was used specifically again because it's a farm to table dish. A lot of like people go out in their backyard farms, they grow their own vegetables. So it's just to evoke that feeling again that my Bubba just went out into the garden and picked the vegetables that were going to be used for the borscht, and then how it's typically served. And then again, like just using the burlap again to give that warm farm feel, home like farm to table feel. And then the backdrop is one that I painted and is plaster with paint, and I created specifically for this image as well. So there's more time because I like the backdrop took me about 8 hours to make. So that time it too went
Wow.
into this image. Yeah.
Well, I like the fact that you had the concept in mind from farm to table before your shot. Most of us, when we submit our images, we come up with the title afterwards.
Mm, yeah.
But it was nice that that was the concept.
hmm a lot
Now,
of times with my food photography, that's how it always is because a lot of my food photography is for magazine or for cookbooks, right? And they all have a story behind them. And
right.
so you always have to, for good food imagery, anyways, even if you're not doing it specifically for a cookbook or a magazine, it helps to have a backstory in your mind
Yeah.
because then you'll make something that looks better.
Yes. Now, were there any specific challenges you faced before or during the shoot?
Um, Before, not so much. During the shoot, I mean, the biggest things is like there's the sprig of dill, and so it's keeping the greens from wilting. So
Yeah.
you have a very short amount of time, and there's a whole like way to keep your greens vibrant. But you have like once you put your dill or your cilantro or whatever, and you have like 10 minutes before you have to take it out, right?
Right.
And so you don't see in my ribbon, like I did first like put there was a napkin in my bowl so I could get my lighting right and do the test shoot shots. And then put in like the cheese. I had to wait until the soup was like lukewarm, but not so warm that it took away from the nature of how it would look if it was hot and freshly poured, because I couldn't have the cheese cubes melt, right? So the cheese
Right.
cubes, like all that stuff needs to be done very time specific. And if
Yeah.
you do not do everything within that short amount of time, then you have to start over.
Right. Yeah, I totally get it. Of the stuff that I have done personally, I know it's not easy.
Yeah.
Now, talking of the lighting, what was your lighting setup?
So it is. I'm the king of one light. That's all I do is one light with flags and black cards and reflectors. So on the top, kind of top right, is a 2 foot octabox with triple diffusion. And so my settings were 1.60th of a second, f3.5, 85 millimeter prime macro lens. This is on my Canon RP, and ISO 100. And so there's a camera, or not a camera, light off the right, and then you can't really see it, but there's a black card to kind of block some of the light coming down in the front. And then there's a black card here to create these dramatic shadows. And then there's a reflector on the bottom left, and then there's a reflector on the table just outside of the bowl to light the front of the bowl. It's
And your light was a flash.
no, it was continuous lighting.
You remember what brand it was?
It was a cheap oh, what's it called? There's the really cheap ones that you can get on Amazon.
Oh, so you don't really need to
No.
invest a whole bunch into
No, that's just the great,
lighting.
yeah, that's the great thing about food photography is
Mm-hmm.
that you can get away with the newer or whatever it's called, right? So you can
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
use
yeah.
those very, very like this. I think I use my 60 watt for this.
Uh huh.
Um, and because I was able to like wide open on everything, it's
Mm-hmm.
fine. Again, for my camera, like the cheapest mirrorless cameras, I don't need anything that has like a quick refocusing time because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even for spill shots, I can get away with doing like the cheapest mirrorless that there is. Like you can get into food photography. You could even like I started with a crop sensor and
Mm-hmm.
50 millimeter, and that's really like even a nifty 50 is all you need.
Yeah.
And I still use my
Right.
nifty 50 very, very often. It has still a very good quality. And
Yes.
unless you're a professional, you can't tell the difference all that time between my nifty 50 and my 85 millimeter macro.
Yeah. I wonder how many professionals can also tell the difference.
I,
I
yeah,
love the Nifty 50. Yeah.
yeah, I love my nifty 50. It's I
Yeah.
use it all the time still.
So what did the post processing look like?
This is how it looked out of camera, raw. And
Mm-hmm.
I always shoot under exposed. That's another thing with food photography is you want to shoot under exposed intentionally. So I shoot like one or two below.
Mm-hmm.
And then so like if we go, I can go, hold on, let me put it back to how it was. So I did a little bit of adjustment of, oops, that just disappeared. I'm going to turn off my mic or my camera while I do this because the less things I have running, the better it will be. So, okay. So the very first thing I always do is a little S curve, just tiny, tiny, tiny.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I did that, I put my exposure up. I also changed my temperature and my tint. Like these are all things. Like my temperature and tint, I actually have a preset that does it automatically. And because
Mm-hmm.
I have a mood and I know that's what I'm going to do, so that stuff that does it automatically. So I changed my exposure. I added a little bit of contrast. I dropped my highlights. I raised my shadows. I upped my whites. I lowered my blacks. Now, if I was doing this for print for a cookbook, I would be raising my lifting my blacks. Added some
Yeah.
texture, clarity, and dehaze. Played with the vibrance and saturation just a little bit, not too much,
Right.
right? These are all like just little. These are things that you would do in a Lightroom situation, right? This is all film developing.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
I added back some of the reds because I shoot in raw, right? So all that color set needs to be up to bit. But so my reds are the things that I played with the most to bring it back to the original color because Canon tends to drain reds a lot. A little bit of the
Mm-hmm.
orange. I took just a little bit of green out, but not much. So the saturation, just a little bit of yellow out, but again, not much. With my luminance, I lifted my reds and my oranges, and I removed blue. That was like these. My luminance are a bit, and then I changed. Like I just did some color shifting to give it a bit of a sepia feeling, but not all that much.
Yeah.
Um, I get some sharpening. I mean, typical things, right? Nothing big, and a little bit of adjustment for my to make it because it wasn't quite level. So I leveled it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did some healing because there was some spot removals that I had to do, but not
Mm-hmm.
much. I did some masking. So
Ah.
again, just to add, like just to drop the exposure just a bit, and played with the
Mm-hmm.
highlights a bit more on that one. And then mask two, I dropped the exposure on the cheese in the background because it was a little bit overexposed, but not much. It was like down 0.49, and that was it for the cheese. And then
Mm-hmm.
I brought it into Photoshop. So this is how it was when I imported it in.
Mm-hmm.
I Don't know why I did it here because normally I would do this in Lightroom, but for
Mm-hmm.
some reason I was wanted to do it's sometimes quicker to do these two things in Photoshop than it is in Lightroom. So I played with the levels, and again it was just here like moving my blacks and my whites a bit, not much.
Mm-hmm.
So just to bring in the tones in, squeeze it all, compress it a bit, and then
Mm-hmm.
I added a sepia photo filter. And again, I started to do this in Lightroom, but sometimes it's just easier to do it in Photoshop. So
Right.
instead of doing the color gradation, like the it has a built-in filter and it's like 17% density. It was just easier to do
Right.
it this way instead of color grading. And then once that was
Yes.
done, I mean, two little quick changes. Not really all that much. Again something that you could do in a Lightroom setting, and it doesn't change anything about the
Mm-hmm.
image. Okay, so when I brought it into Lightroom, before I did any more adjustments, Photoshop made the blacks way too black.
Yeah. Okay.
So I did some masking. So the first thing I did was I masked the bowl because that's where I wanted to keep the focus. And
Mm-hmm.
so I raised exposure just a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
like not even a
Mm-hmm.
full point. And then I reversed the mask. Oh, this one. Um, is it this one? Yeah, I reversed the mask and then I dropped the exposure on the back. Yeah, that was, yeah, I just did a little bit of masking. Let me turn the masking off. And I just don't have that on. Um, yeah, just changing the exposure a bit with those two masks
Mm-hmm.
fixed the black color. So that's um that's how I processed it. Very quick, very quick. I mean, the processing took maybe half an hour.
So now I love the line you have got on your website, warm, comforting food that gives the viewer a hug and invites them to pull up a chair. That's beautiful.
Thank you. It's very important to
Yeah.
me. I grew up in a lot of communities where food culture is very important. Um,
Right.
I grew up with a lot of new Canadians. I grew up around a lot of Punjabi people. And that's like food culture. You can't go into. I grew up around Eastern Europeans and Punjabi people, and both those cultures, you cannot go into their homes and refuse food. Like you go in
Right.
and you eat, and disputes are settled over food, and communities over food, and you feed you feed people who are hurting in some way. Um,
Yeah.
and so food has always been a source of community for me, and that is what my I want my images to reflect, that those heart connections and community connections that we have with each other. And so that's
Yeah.
why I photograph and process the way I do, is because food not it's not only about our bodies, but it also nourishes our souls. And there are a lot of studies that show that when you're cut off from the foods that you grew up with, you actually will develop depression and psychological distress symptoms that actually manifest into physical symptoms because stress isn't good for you. So,
No, no, no.
it's really important that you have access to those foods. And like we all have a memory of one dish that when we think about
Yeah.
it, we have that, like it's that heart connection. We all have one. So
Right.
that's I love food just for that reason. And I was really surprised when I decided I was going to pick up a camera again, how because I hated photography. I mean, well, okay, so I don't want to say I hated it. I did not get enjoyment from it. And I misremembered my story. And I always forget this part because before I got into food photography in 2020, I actually did photography, but it was in a corporate, like for marketing purposes when I had a marketing firm. And so it was like things like corporate portraitures and product like things, cold, distant.
Yeah.
I hated it. And so I always blocked that part out, that no, I actually did it for my marketing company that I had, until I talk about how when I got into food and
Mm.
like instantly fell in love with it because I was like, oh my God, like I there's feeling here, and you can make people feel actual feelings and give that sense of, oh my God, that's my grandma's kitchen, or that's my mom's kitchen, or
Yeah.
that's whoever's kitchen, right?
Yeah.
So
No, I think it's very important to be in love with the image you see through the
hmm
viewfinder. It is very, very important. Now, you have a very interesting and unique niche, which is so closely coupled with a passion that's acting as a massive driving force in your work, and that has also led to the creation of Disabled Kitchen and Garden, your
hmm
website, and a few cookbooks like you showed. You want to talk quickly about that? What led you to its creation and how it ties up with your photography work?
so I want to say 2019,
Mm-hmm.
I got a electric pressure cooker, and it was born out of anger and frustration because people poo-pooing tools that are good for disabled people and dismissing their capabilities. And in this case, it was for years and years and years, everybody's telling me you need to get an Instapot. And then immediately they would spend 10 minutes telling me all the things they hated about their Instapot. And I'm like, why would I buy something you hate? This does not compute to me. Stop. And then I saw, so I'm disabled and I'm a wheelchair user, as well as having some visual problems. And I saw another disabled person who is also a well-known cookbook author using the Instapot and talking about how it helped them with their rheumatoid arthritis and how they could cook again. And they also come from a food culture that is very, very strong.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh my God, this is like life changing. And so I bought an Instapot and I started developing recipes for it, and it was life changing. And so I started to develop recipes that have cultural significance that traditionally take a long, long time to cook, and so they're the first foods that people tend to be disconnected from once they become disabled or lower mobility. And so I wanted to give back and give the tools to other people so they could reclaim their foods and teach them everything like um, it's the same thing that's in this cookbook, which is an offshoot of the website. Every recipe teaches you a tool or a skill that you could apply to any other recipe in your
Mm-hmm.
culture. So you may learn how to, like, there's a Thai chicken curry recipe in here. So if you know how to do that Thai curry recipe, then you could do a bunch of other Thai curry recipes, right? It's the same skill set. You don't need to have 20 different curry recipes to know how to cook one curry for that method, right? There's other curry methods to use, but for that specific method. Um, so yeah, and then it turned into like hydroponic gardening and just other things, like as I would find them for it to help me regain either cooking or gardening or whatever things that I love to do, then I would share it with other people because like we need food. I mean,
Right,
right?
right,
Like
right.
food isn't a want. Food is a need.
Yes.
And when you're disabled, food is like one of the first things you lose access to.
Right. And food is also a medium of connections.
I mean, like, it's community. It's
Yes.
like we do everything around food. Like
Yeah, yeah,
like fight and have friendly arguments and yelling at each other in the kitchen when we're
right,
right. Like everything happens around food in a family, the good and the
right.
not so good. But they're all part of community. So.
Yeah, I think your concept and idea is such a noble one, and um, uh, kudos for you to you for doing this. But a question
Mhm,
comes to mind. Um, Disabilities are of different varying kinds, right?
mhm,
Um, Do you address only specific ones in the cookbook,
So
or it's generalized?
it's I don't address specific disabilities. I address symptoms, and let me just grab the ones because there are like common symptoms that we share despite our
Mm-hmm.
disability. And I don't want to screw up what the ones they are because so pain, fatigue, impaired executive function, otherwise known as brain fog, insomnia, which kind of feeds into all that, wildly fluctuating energy levels, and chronic
Mm-hmm.
illness. So like that's covers so if you're
Yeah.
like mobility issues, pain issues, ADHD and autism and um, another thing that's cropping up right now is long COVID. And it even
Mm-hmm.
works for like I have a whole section in here on how to prepare your pantry for surgery recovery. So you have 6 weeks worth of
Oh
meals.
wow.
Because as I was developing this book, I also had 3 surgeries in 2020. That's a lot of surgeries in one
Wow.
year,
Yeah.
right? And so,
Right.
so it helps people like even if it's just temporarily because you're having
Mm-hmm.
surgery or whatever, or if you have a
Mm-hmm.
long-term chronic illness and
Mm-hmm.
you have pain or fatigue or whatever, there's like tools and tips to like even simple things that people don't think about anymore. Like sit
Mm-hmm.
down and prepare. You don't have to prepare in your kitchen. Grab everything, bring it into your living room, put it on your coffee table, and watch TV as you peel potatoes and carrots. Like your kitchen doesn't have to be your prep space. Um,
Right.
do what you have to do so you can buy frozen vegetables. They're just as healthy as the ones you get in the frozen food aisle. All these
Yeah.
things that we are told in society make us lazy if we do. My
Mm-hmm.
book is a lot of no, you're not lazy. You're feeding yourself. Congratulations. You're like do what you need to do. You're not lazy. You are working. It's all about my book is all about figuring out what your limits are for that day and working within
Mm-hmm.
within those limits. And congratulations,
Right.
you got something done and you respected your body in the process.
Yeah. Makes sense. Now, you're one of the few photographers who's trying to make a specific difference in the world using photography as well as your knowledge on cooking and gardening. But let's talk specifically about photography. Looking back at what challenges you've gone through to make it happen, what guidance would you give another photographer who may have a deep desire to make a difference through their work? How should they go about it?
Hmm, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's starting with little things because you're not going to change the world overnight, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to do this really ambitious art exhibit where I was going to interview a bunch of like disabled people and food producers and all that other stuff. And then COVID happened, and I had to put it down to one small art exhibit. That was celebrating farmers and people overcoming because we had COVID and then we had the atmospheric river, and that cut us off. And it was like everyone was focusing on like what's happening on the mainland because that was huge. But here on the island, like it devastated. We're still doing high. We were cut off from like everywhere on the like we were cut off. Our farms were underwater. We're in a severe drought for like 5 years now. Um, all this stuff, right? So it was a celebration of that and celebrating community and how we came together as a community through food to help each other out. We didn't have like we even not covered here because it wasn't as a big thing, but even the local Gurdwara here helped out with food and all that other stuff like they were doing in Surrey and flying it to Hope. All those things that we did to keep each other afloat during COVID. Um, Not everyone has the means to do something like that, but again, it's about starting small and figuring out what small thing you can change or do in your community. Like even if it is doing like a 3 image series on some type of cause to bring awareness for it and then displaying it on your website and maybe sending a press release to your local paper and trying to get covered that way, right? Um, People will look at art and have conversations around it. So create
Mm-hmm.
the art that is designed to start a conversation, and be
Mm-hmm.
intentional about it, and make sure it's a cause that you're directly connected to in some way. It's always better. Like I do stuff around disability and queer rights and stuff like that because those are causes that affect me and my communities, and it's
Mm-hmm.
much more. Um, it's always better when it's coming from somebody who's directly affected by it because you can feel it, right? Like it comes through in the art. It's not really something that you can say this is how I make it come through in my art. It's just as art is an extension of who we are, and so it naturally just comes out in our art.
Right, right, right.
And it's difficult as like where do I start? And just think like what is that one thing that you're really really passionate about, and
Yeah.
and going from there and just starting really small and building up. And one day you might and then it's like a bunch of small steps until you get that big idea, and you're equipped with the tools and the knowledge and the skills to be able to finally um, like my cookbook started with one recipe, and then it became this whole career out of one recipe. Um, and now I shoot other cookbooks, and I have an agent and all of that other stuff, right? Just because in 2019 I got the idea that I wanted to help other disabled people to be able to feed themselves.
Yeah. No, it's true. If you do something that's close to your heart, um, it will have tremendous meaning to
Hmm.
you as well. Now, do you have any new cookbooks coming out or any new projects that you want to talk about?
Um, I am currently developing another cookbook. It's going to be wild. Cookbooks take years, but it's about grief and food and
Oh.
how again it's about community. But so it's always been the men in my life who have been the cooks and the people who brought food in my life. And one of my dads died suddenly in March. And he's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about cooking and love cooking. And when he died, all I wanted to do was bake, right? And it wasn't even so much that I wanted to bake something specific. It was just like I need to bake all the things,
Mhm.
and because he loved my baking, right? And it wasn't,
Mhm.
and so. But it made me think like we all have rituals again around food and around grief. And somebody dies, you bring them over a casserole, or you bring over meals or whatever, right? There's
Right.
whole entire funeral rituals that are surround food
Right.
amongst lots of different cultures, right? And
Right.
so it's exploring how we all and grief isn't a bad thing. Grief is good. Grief is natural. Grief, we get to talk about the people that we love and remember them and pay tribute to them, right? And um,
Mhm.
I know when I'm grieving, I'm not sorry that they're dead. I'm sorry for my like we're all sorry for ourselves that we're no longer have this person in our life, and that's fine. And that's why we remember them, and that's how we keep them alive. And it's yeah, so it's exploring different, not only my own dishes that I associate with grief and the love that also comes with grief, but I also will be interviewing other people from a variety of cultures and what is their story of grief and food, and exploring that.
That is so interesting. So interesting and so diverse from anything
Yeah.
that I've come across. Now, where can viewers see more of your work or follow you?
They my food business, food photography website is polariscreative.ca, and then my author, general personal website, where because I'm also write nonfiction and I'm out on submission soon for a nonfiction or for a fiction book, I mean. And so, if people want to know more about like keep up to that, then that's julessherred.com, and then disabledkitchenandgarden.ca for that for my food stuff, like cooking, and not just
Okay.
photography.
All right. I will put all those links in the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Jules. it has been such a pleasure chatting with you.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you too.
Now, if you've enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.